welcome to another video. Today it is a super quick tutorial of how to French seam a shoulder seam with a grown-on facing, so you end up with a nice and neat interior like this. So let's get started. Okay, so we are looking up at this upside down because it's the easiest way that I can get it onto my table to show you, but this is the finished edge of the grown-on facing and this is the shoulder seam. Usually with a grown-on facing there will be a point that you need to sew to and then clip through to. So I've sewn and reinforced that point there. I am now going to clip up to but not through my stitching. So that's just separated my shoulder seam allowance and the grown-on facing allowance, and I'm going to do that for both sides. This is my back piece and I have finished the back neck edge with bias binding as per the instructions for this pattern. This is the 6563. Depending on what pattern you're using, you may need to do a different finish on the back of the neck, but you need to finish your neck and your front independently so that we can then sew them together. So if we were going to do this the way that the pattern would suggest, we would take our front piece and our back piece and we would pin the seam allowance right sides together, matching up the notches, and then you would take your grown-on facing and kind of bend it around, and then you would sew from this point to the armhole edge, and that would encase the facing and finish it off. Now we're going to French seam this, so we're going to sew ours together, wrong sides together at 1/4 of an inch first, so that we can trim off the excess seam allowance, sew it together again to enclose the raw edge like you would with a French seam. Whilst you're doing all of that, you're completely ignoring this facing. You are literally just sewing the shoulder from the back to the shoulder of the front, and you're going to completely ignore this. This will not get sewn into anything as yet. Okay, so with wrong sides together, I've sewn the shoulder seams together at 1/4 of an inch, and I have completely left out and not touched the facing. So now that I have sewn the 1/4 of an inch seam, I'm going to trim it down. And again, trying to do this on camera is a little difficult, but I'm going to trim it down to 1/8 of an inch, and you want to trim off from the back piece as well, because as you can see, this front piece, this is the back neckline, and the front seam actually starts probably about 5/8 of an inch in, but you still want to trim off the excess from that back piece as well. So we're going to just trim off the excess from this seam so that we can go and press it right sides together. And I'm going to do that for both sides. So now that both of those seams are trimmed, I am going to go and press this so the right sides are together so we can sew the final part of the French seam at 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so I have pressed the seam so that the right sides are together, and we're now going to sew at 3/8 of an inch. You're going to be sewing from that reinforcement pivot point there along this edge at 3/8 of an inch to enclose the raw edge, and again we are keeping the facing free, and I'm going to do that for both sides. I have sewn the 3/8 of an inch seam line. As you can see, I've gone over the reinforcing stitching that I'd done earlier up to the point, but again the facing is free. So now is when we finish the facing. So we're going to fold the facing around to the back neck edge line, and we're going to sandwich the back panel in between the front facing and the front bodice piece, and we're going to sew again along this reinforcing stitching line. So you will have a little bit of fabric hanging over there, and that's the 1/4 of an inch that's taken up by the French seam. So once you've sewn that into place, we can trim off all this excess and then we turn it through. So you'll then have a nice French seamed shoulder seam and a nicely finished facing that encloses all the raw edges. If you want to pink this edge, you totally can. I never bother, but it is something that you can do if you'd like to. Okay, so once you've sewn it down, you should end up with something that looks like this. So I'm going to trim off this excess piece here, and then also this bulky bit of bias binding that's finishing our back neck edge, so that I can turn everything through and I'll end up with a nice smooth join. So that can come off, that can come off. And then once you turn it through, so you'll have a nice join along here from the back neck edge to the front folded edge, so where the facing goes in. And then on the inside, you will end up with a nicely finished shoulder seam with the facing attached like this. Now, there is some raw edges in there, so if you want to just tack this little edge of the facing to the French seam just to make sure that that doesn't peek out ever, you can do. Personally, I don't worry, and again, I haven't even pinked that edge because it's not going to be next to the skin. It won't get any wear and tear, and I haven't had any problems with previous ones. So we need to press our shoulder seam. We haven't done that yet. We need to press the shoulder seam towards the front. You'll have to because of the way that the facing kind of makes everything lie, and then we can get on with the rest of the top. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!